for agreeing to give this debriefing on COP28, and we hope to listen to you now. And there are several who have joined online as well. So
yes.
Yeah, so you'll be able to.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, Sangeeta, for that introduction. And COP28 is the third COP that I have attended since I joined MSSRF, and it's always, I think, appropriate to come back and speak to you about it, because I think, as I was telling another colleague from South Africa, if you are part of the actual process there, then you are so caught up with the details and it becomes so intense that you have something like PTSD afterwards. You have negotiator fatigue. So I think it's very useful to step back and reflect on what happened there and come to some kind of assessment. My presentation today will not be in any sense in a official capacity, though I'm informed by what is happening officially. And as full disclosure, of course, you know that I was part of the delegation as a technical expert member. So let's get to the subject at hand. The picture that you see here is not my doing. It is Microsoft pulled it out of the cloud and suggested it, and I sort of picked it up as I went along. So it vaguely suggests a glass half full, which is something that the media has been suggesting regarding the outcome of the COP. Let me say in response to answering that question right away, that COP28 was in many ways a qualified success for developing countries, and particularly the large developing countries, the so-called emerging economies, including India. So particularly also for India, I would say it was a qualified success. But this success for standing our ground came at a price. And it is not a price that we can do anything about, but comes from the overall geopolitical situation on climate change and the attitude of the developed countries. So that still remains a very key stumbling block to effective action. But the emerging economies still have considerable responsibilities towards a substantial part of the global population in terms of their basic developmental agenda. And so in that sense, I would say COP28 was also a qualified success. So let us get into the details. So the formal agenda of COP28 was, of course, many of you would be aware of this. The first and most important agenda item was the so-called global stocktake. So somewhat not very easy term on the tongue, but it's an odd term, but it was officially adopted in the Paris Agreement, and it refers to a process of reviewing the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is structured as a voluntary contribution by everybody. There are no legally binding commitments on anybody except what you choose to commit on your part. So there is no external sort of quote-unquote pressure on you. However, the idea is that every 5 years we would review the progress, all countries together, and then we would see what progress we are making, what is needed, and of course, how to go forward. Now, in this process, of course, eventually you have to come to the question of who is doing how much. So you can hardly say, is MSSRF doing well? Of course, MSSRF may be doing well or not doing well, but if every individual will take a responsibility for their share, then it is not very useful to say whether we are doing well or not. No, we all have to do what is our contribution. So it's as simple as that. But nevertheless, the way the Paris Agreement is structured, this issue is pushed into the background. So it becomes a very complex process of negotiation in order to figure out how to conduct this review. So this has been a 2-year process, and the COP28 was the culmination of this process. Another major item on the agenda was, of course, implementing the adaptation aspect of the Paris Agreement, which had been largely set aside or not paid much attention to, is referred to as the global goal on adaptation. It's a very general statement in the Paris Agreement about increasing resilience and reducing vulnerabilities, said in a little more words, but basically this is the idea. But nevertheless, we have to have some way of operationalizing this. Otherwise, it was just a bunch of words which one needed to give substance to. So adopting a framework. Then there was an issue of what is now referred to as just transitions. I will not go into this in too much detail. We can talk about this a little later, or maybe at the time of the question and answer session. The loss and damage fund, bringing it on board, getting it operational, was a major issue. And that, of course, is on the agenda. Finance, there is this ongoing back and forth between developed and developing countries on climate finance. And finally, the ongoing negotiations about Article 6 carbon trading. For a change, the Article 6 carbon trading fell apart because the US could not agree with the EU, basically. Maybe other developing countries also had different sides in the discussion, but that was that. Okay, so this was the formal agenda. The COP28 presidency, you see, in all these conference of parties, the presidency has a significant role to play because it sort of steers the discussion. And the extent to which it intervenes and the manner in which it intervenes, the issues it raises, etc., have a very determinate influence. Countries which host the COP see it as a very important aspect of their foreign policy outreach, foreign policy work, their positioning in the world. All of us are aware of that from the way India itself handled the fact of its G20 presidency. So it's a big thing. So the COP28 presidency, puts forward its own vision of what it wants to achieve in that COP. And it is not necessarily exactly what is on the formal official agreed agenda. So one of these was, of course, they wrote repeatedly, the COP28 president in particular, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, who many of you would have heard and seen in the media. So he, under his signature, there were repeated, 3-4 major letters from the presidency. So this is the way he looked at it in one of these letters. One is what he called fast-tracking the energy transition and slashing emissions before 2030. All the adjectives are literally from the letter. So you see the kind of language that is being utilized. So 3 items were there: keeping 1.5-degree goal alive or within reach. The wording itself suggests that it is somewhat on need of life support. And I will argue that it is, shall we say, in very serious condition, very critical, notwithstanding all the hype. Then the goal of global peaking by 2025, a global emission reduction target, and a reference to this energy transition being just, orderly, and equitable. Then, of course, the other part of the agenda was to deliver on finance. The promise USD 100 billion by 2020 is simply not happening. We are in 2023. The OECD claims that they have disbursed 89 billion to the developing countries in the last year that they accounted for, 2021 maybe. And or no developing country buys that number as accurate. So that is an ongoing thing. Adaptation finance has been a in a pathetic state, in fact, if you would use the term. And adaptation finance, the goal is to double it. India's position is that even this is a bit ridiculous because the base level is so low that doubling it is not going to do very much for you when the asking is actually in the order of a couple of 100 billion or something going forward, or even more, you know. The third part of the agenda was to put nature, people, lives, and livelihoods at the heart of climate action. Part of it, of course, was welcome. Adopting the framework of the global goal on adaptation, putting in place the loss and damage fund. But then there were leader-level declarations on transformation, food systems and agriculture, and on climate and health, which raised their own class of problems. So then, of course, there was some call for an inclusive COP, etc., which is more not so much our concern today. The developed countries, of course, have always a different agenda. And that agenda goes back 30 years. Till they signed the UNFCCC and then found that having signed the UNFCCC, implementing it was not such a simple task. And the US politics, both domestic politics and their international vision, has progressively, not progressively is the wrong word, has continually evolved somewhat regressively. So the greater and greater danger of their doing less, they want to do less, they want to pass the burdens on. And they walked out of, they never joined the Kyoto Protocol because they said until India and China take equivalent emission reduction commitments, they walked out of the Paris Agreement until Biden brought the United States back in. It all depends on next year's election, what will happen, whether the US will be still there or not. So alongside, of course, this is the US in particular, but the European Union, US, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the OECD countries basically have a very clear agenda. And this agenda consists of the following elements. The first is they want to revise and reformulate the idea of equity, dilute it from its climate focus, by including all kinds of other elements, whatever you can think of is there in their list. Dilute differentiation. So the term common but differentiated responsibilities, which defines global action and is very important. People think it is trivial, but it is not. As climate climate policy globally moves into the era of actual implementation, this term has significance in international law. So, so one should not be dismissive about the use of the term CBDR and RC. We sort of say it very simply, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So I'll say again a little bit about that. So they wanted to dilute all reference to responsibility, historical, current, or the future. And the sort of very negative aspect of this was that they were so bent on removing, especially at COP28, they were so bent on removing the differentiated responsibility that they wanted to remove the word responsibility altogether. I mean, sort of, put it aside completely. And that, of course, is ridiculous because then it leaves us also without any responsibility because it is common and differentiated responsibility. So in order to bolster their own position, the idea that to remove the word responsibility altogether was a very negative trend, and it is one of the successes of the developing countries that we did not allow this to happen. And it is not to be underestimated, it is not simply words. The other thing, of course, they wanted that everything was to be subservient to mitigation, all development, all talk of equity, all assistance, all finance, everything. They called it ambition. But it was like once in a discussion, we pointed out, several of us, that ambition without the ability to do it or feasibility makes very little sense. So ambition. And the other thing is to spread the mitigation into all critical developmental sectors, including forests, agriculture, and health, defending their unilateral imposition of border tariffs based on the carbon footprint of goods which are coming in, which are has a very negative impact on trade for developing countries. And for climate finance, undoing the public source concessional finance idea of climate finance and moving it all towards private investment and private sector and investment. Now, obviously, for adaptation, even mitigation, develop a large number of developing countries need concessional finance. But especially in adaptation, to think that you would have private sector finance with guaranteed returns as a means of undertaking finance is simply not on. And a lot of developing countries, whatever their internal differences, were very clear about this. So this is broadly the developed countries' agenda. So what was India's role? I think India made its position very clear in the starting phase of the COP28 itself, while Prime Minister Modi offered India's support and all consideration to the success of the Conference of Parties. India has always made it a point that it will not be seen as a naysayer. This is a long-standing thing in Indian policy. But the PM, in his statement inaugurating the high-level segment in every COP, has a parallel alongside the negotiations, a parallel set of events where heads of state from different countries or their representatives come and speak briefly. And it goes through the entire 2 weeks. So at the high-level segment, this time Prime Minister Modi inaugurated that segment, and he made 5 points which were very clear. And this is quite remarkable, and it was very sharply, briefly made. I encourage you to look it up on your own. First, he said, all developing countries must have a fair share of the global carbon budget. I think this is a very significant statement delivered with the highest authority, and you can read the various consequences of that. He called for balance between the various aspects of climate action. He reiterated how an energy transition should be just, inclusive, and equitable. Then the need for continuous development of innovative technology. And this, I think, is very often forgotten in certain circles. This is useful to reiterate. And the transfer of technologies to other countries. And indeed, he used the term without selfishness, and strengthening the clean energy supply chain. So India's position of where it stood, of course, there are negotiations to follow, but where it stood was very clearly articulated in the PM statement. Finally, of course, India, in another signal, refused on grounds of equity and the conflation or the confusion of mitigation with adaptation. India did not sign the global pledge. Independent of the negotiations, there was a sort of leaders' declaration. It refused to sign the pledge on tripling renewable energy capacity because it singled out coal as substituting coal and called for the phase out of coal alongside without similar language for oil and gas. So India did not sign the renewable energy series. One of the major reasons was this. And on agriculture, food security and climate and health, India's considered stand was that you cannot conflate the actual delivery of these services or the activities of farmers, etc., with the entire supply chain. So, including the supply chain along with the services themselves, conflates mitigation and adaptation. So very clearly throughout the COP, India took a clear position that you want to talk about adaptation, supply chains are not part of the story. Okay, so this was made very clear in the beginning. So the GST, the global stock take, I refer to it as GST, the GST decision had some very strong positive points and others were, shall we say, it was if you want to use the language of confrontation, you would say it was a draw in terms of the debates that took place. So the strong references to equity and differentiation were retained. And as I repeat myself, that this is not a minor matter. And this is very important for the world going forward. In fact, there is a reference to the International Court of Justice, which is being heard for following the resolution of the General Assembly, calling for an opinion from them on rights and the issue of climate change. So asserting these principles very clearly is even more important. The key reference to responsibility, especially historical responsibility of the developed countries and how their inaction has led to the crisis is clearly stated. It is not as long or detailed as we would have liked, but it is certainly clearly stated. On mitigation is a very important aspect, and this is partly, the effort of India, which always focuses not on the sort of confusing issue of net zero versus peaking, etc., but how it is the cumulative emissions, the carbon budget, which is the determining factor for mitigation. So the noting of the substantial depletion of the carbon budget appears in the text. This is very important. Enhance efforts towards halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. There is a passing reference to the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but it says very clearly in the context of social and environmental safeguards. So you're not indiscriminately planting for carbon wherever you like. So that is very clearly stated. So there is a key reference to developed countries taking the lead in climate action, but not alongside the most important paragraph. So anyway, so these are more this thing. So the global emission reduction targets, which the developed countries are so much after, are present in the report, but very importantly with two major qualifications. First, it recognizes it as a finding of the scientists, but not necessarily, therefore, immediately actionable. And in what form it should be actionable is clarified. So it also recognizes, and this is a contribution that I have some personal pleasure in pointing out, because with my colleague Tejal from NIAS, we have been working on this with our student. So the IPCC scenarios from where these peaking targets and the emission reduction targets come are scenarios built on many assumptions. So these assumptions on pathways based on global model pathways and assumptions is the language which is used. This is somewhat a weak language. At some stage in the negotiations, very interestingly, an entire paragraph explaining what these assumptions were and how equity was missing in these assumptions was suggested as a footnote, so that developed countries threw a fit over it and some others as well. So as a result, it didn't appear in the final text. The language here is very similar to what is there in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration. But whatever it is, this point is recognized that it is not a given. And I will just quickly illustrate in the next few minutes why is it that this point is important. Then, of course, there is a long caveat which says clearly that developing countries cannot simply peak their emissions in the same time frame, that they will need another time frame. What, of course, it is not made clear, and as I will explain again in just a little bit, that this means that 1.5 would be difficult to keep. Now, of course, 1.5 being difficult to keep does not mean it is because the developing countries are not doing something, but that on grounds of equity, what the developed countries should have done and have not done, and what they are still reluctant to do, is pushing us in a direction where 1.5 will be difficult to achieve. Maybe restricting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the text also has this 43% reduction, 60% 2035. We would have been happier, of course, if the caveat had been applied here also, because this follows the language of the G20 leaders declaration, more or less. For all practical purposes, everybody knows what this is talking about. So this is the paper which where we first discussed this. Our discussion and thread of argument has been picked up by others, and subsequently it has become a matter of policy with many of the leading voices among the developing countries. So here, of course, is that famous paragraph which the media is talking about, the fossil fuel paragraph, where it talks of the need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with 1.5 degree pathways. So that is a concession to developed countries and some of their friends, like the island states, etc., and calls on parties to contribute to the following global efforts, but with caveats at a nationally determined manner, taking into account the Paris Agreement. Now, you might ask, why should I say this? So the Paris Agreement is all under the Paris Agreement. But it's a kind of reinforcing the idea that everything in the Paris Agreement, including all statements referring to equity and differentiation, apply here. Just emphasizing this. And then, of course, under different national circumstances, pathways and approaches. So, this is a call to contribute. You can see what is possible, but it also requires support, technology transfer, your developmental level. All of this is involved. So the first line on tripling renewable energy capacity globally here is not an issue for India. Accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power is language which appeared in Glasgow. So India is not particularly disturbed by it. And of course, there are further caveats, as I said in the beginning, that says very clearly. And India's position on this is not about when you will net zero, this is a dirty fuel, this is a cleaner fuel. It's about what is your share of the carbon budget. And how do you stay within your share of the carbon budget? So then, of course, net zero emission energy system, this is actually a lot of, padding to make developed countries and some others who are fossil fuel dependent very happy. This is a very confused statement if you actually try to figure out what it is, but here it is. But B is a very important addition, as has been noted by everybody, and this is fair enough. For India, even though we approached it within the scope of our friendship and partnership with other countries like China, Saudi Arabia, etc., overall, at the end of the day, the appearance of a statement on transitioning away, notice is not phase out or phase down, it is transitioning. So somebody cleverly found a new word to put in there. So transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly and equitable manner, that's from the COP28 Presidency onwards. Civil society is reasonably happy with this. Accelerating action to achieve net zero. So in some sense, all fossil fuels are on board, not just coal. So I think this is not something which we should regret. This is something India can welcome within always the scope of the overall framing that we have made clear to the world. So I think then, of course, there are some sectoral issues. This is not very happy thing, but, we will not stand in the way, particularly if they are not very onerous in terms of commitments. This thing about methane has to be dealt with in detail. The whole perspective on methane in the negotiations still remains the older perspective on how methane contributes to warming. This has undergone important shift in the recent IPCC 6th assessment report that has not yet been reflected here. So we'll deal with that later. The rest of it is standard, and we have seen it on several occasions. So in the last few remaining minutes, without going into other details of what happened in the negotiations, which I can answer in question time, let me just very quickly tell you what are the issues that arise when you deal with such global targets and why equity and differentiation becomes so important. So what is the point by the developed countries? The developed countries do not want to talk of the global carbon budget. Why do they not want to talk about it? Because the global carbon budget is a very clearly a global commons, of which they have appropriated a completely disproportionate share. Now, if you don't want to calculate it on a per capita basis, or you have a slightly modified scheme, you can do whatever you want. In whichever way you want, more or less you will always find that they have disproportionately, by any criterion, just grabbed, just like you do land grab, they grabbed a piece of the disproportionate share of the global commons. So what is the challenge? So here is the Annex 1 countries in their population 19%, non-Annex 1 is 81%. If you take historical non-LULUCF, but in non-land use change, land use change, forests, etc., but in the industrial and other sectors, you take non-Annex 1 has contributed only 32%. And Annex 1, 68%. If you take China out of this, then the number drops even more dramatically. So this is really what has happened. 4/5 of the carbon budget, this is why it is exhausted. So this happens even after 1990. So the non-EIP Annex 1 refers to the non-former Soviet bloc countries, the OECD countries, Western Europe, US, etc. And look at their disproportionate consumption. 47% of all GHGs between 91 and 2020. So what is the 43%? where does this 43% come? Why is not 44, 45? Why is not 50? Why is not 60? Why 43%? So this is based on the median value of global modeled pathways assessed by IPCC 6 for limiting warming to 1.5 degree increase. In these scenarios, okay, these are made with very strong assumptions. And these assumptions are more or less that the developed countries will do what is in their current NDCs, maybe a little more in some cases, but by and large, the bulk of the emissions reduction will come from the developing countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is the worst sufferer. In fact, it is very shocking because if you look at the current energy consumption per capita per year of some 6 African countries, you will find that they are less than the energy consumption of an American refrigerator a year. So it's completely, these models are shocking. Now, these models may have been constructed with different reasons, but they are all now being used to justify what should be the global reduction targets, and it is impossible to accept. Not only that, it says they project a permanent inequality, and not only permanent inequality, this is something we should consider being our agenda. All of these scenarios compromise food security. All of these scenarios increase the number of people at risk of hunger. A number which is going down will be reversed if you do this kind of mitigation, which is suggested here. And a massive rise in poverty levels. Why does this happen? Because 1.5 can be achieved only by massive amounts of carbon capture in the natural resources sector. Okay, but if you have seen in the media this back and forth about sugar and ethanol, whether sugarcane can be used for ethanol production for biofuel, or should it be withdrawn? The government banned it a few months or so ago, and now they have reversed the ban again. So, the displacement of food production by the demands of biofuel production and carbon capture in the natural resources sector is the biggest threat to poverty alleviation in the 1.5 degree scenarios which are being projected. So obviously these are very difficult to accept. This is not being discussed publicly by the IPCC, which is very disturbing. But alternate scenarios are possible. What happened? Yes. So you can see that if you change the burden, for left-hand side is the burden which the developed countries, which the IPCC has projected, where the reduction is 43% by Annex 1 and 45% by non-Annex 1. Okay. However, if you have a more equitable thing, you can construct alternate scenarios. If we reduce by 96%, then we can grow by developing countries can go by 9%. So all these possibilities definitely exist. So if you have, if it is not 1.5 degrees that we are targeting, and if it is 2 degrees that we are targeting, then there is greater flexibility. So this is the issue. Similarly, the story with the peaking. This is an interesting graph which you can see. We plot over time, given the cumulative emissions up to every year. Okay, what is the fair share of the developed countries, which is in orange, and the dotted line, the full line is their actual cumulative emissions. Look at the gap. And look at the non-Annex 1, exactly the reverse. And what is it that they are projecting? In the 1.5 IPCC scenarios, we never get our fair share. And they reduce, but they are always getting more than their fair share. In the slightly different, we can construct an alternate scenario, which is you see on the right. But even there, this historic deprivation and this lack of carbon space, we can restore only in a minor fashion. So these are the issues which are possible. So I will skip these graphs, get on with so the same story with tripling global renewable energy capacity. So how is it that we are going to do it? Who is going to do it? So is it going to be that based on future demand, or are they going to replace their fossil fuel infrastructure with renewable energy? So a huge lot of difference between the two scenarios. And mind you, to date, whatever it has declared, the US, you cannot open a document like you can for India, where you can say India's target is 500 gigawatt. If you open a document, there's no document where you can open and read the US will have so much gigawatt of renewable energy installed capacity by such and such a year. And they told me, but people like me and others, that explicitly that they're never going to give absolute targets. So why should the world take an absolute target when the biggest emitter ever in history will not take an absolute target? So that's the kind of issue. So India was very clear. Energy efficiency we can discuss later. So the other GST decision elements also reflected what happened in other negotiations. The GGA framework was passed, which is a good thing. That sentence is incomplete. Anyway, so the issue of targets and indicators is still open. That will be quite contentious. Adaptation finance is this thing. We were fairly successful developing countries. India was also active in this very much, our colleagues from the ministry. So all this backdoor, whenever they talk of adaptation, they always bring in mitigation through the back door. So either you call it maladaptation or you ask for transformational adaptation. So to some extent, we have managed to minimize this emphasis. And one of the things that the die-hard position was taken by the developed countries is that they refuse to allow any direct reference to the fact that they are imposing customs and tariff measures which will disadvantage our export to those countries based on our carbon footprint of those goods. So these unilateral measures, which is the EU calls it the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. US is doing similar things are coming from the UK. So this is a very problematic thing, and the developing countries were united strongly in opposing this. They made their unhappiness and anger, if you wish, at this very clear, but it simply would not pass. The developed countries are dead set on this. Very oddly, I must say, in the middle of the negotiations, when these conflicts were at their height, Indian industry held a meeting where the Tatas and the spokesperson for the CIA all said that CBAM is a good thing for Indian industry. Very odd, frankly. I can have a separate debate on that matter, but not for now. On finance, there are some issues. I won't go into it now. So what is the way forward? We were quite concerned that it would disrupt the Paris Agreement processes. Luckily, that has happened only in a minor way. However, of course, the most important thing is all countries would have to submit a revised nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement 9 to 12 months prior to COP30. And the Paris Agreement, in a somewhat confusing language, for the highest possible ambition. It doesn't qualify it as at that time. If I have the highest possible ambition, now what do I do next year? No, so it's a bit odd, the language. So you have to figure this out. One has to take this on board very carefully. And there will be 2 independent cycles of workshops and discussions to ramp up the GST. You can expect a lot of diplomatic and other pressure on this, also through trade and finance. The voluntary nature of the NDCs, which is something which was sought by the developed countries, will, however, be subverted when it comes to our NDCs. So this is a tricky issue over the next year. So just to wrap up, I think there will be a massive pressure on developing countries from a post-GST agenda. They will continue to pressure for sectoral targets, which will be very difficult for countries like India to give. 1.5 degrees at this time in the projections that we have seems fairly out of reach. So it would be very difficult for developing countries to say this in official statements. But as a scientific community and as a policy community looking forward to charting our future, the idea that we will somehow help the world reach 1.5 is something that we should not, we cannot accept. I wouldn't say even accept, even if you wanted it to do it, even if you were in all good faith, wanted to do your best to keep temperature increase to 1.5, anything that we could do will not be able to solve the problem. So India has to look forward to 1.7 to 2 degrees centigrade warming as its future strategy. By and large, over the next few years, the rest of the world will, I think, realize this as well. So this is an important takeaway, and we have seen no real dramatic change from those who are capable of making this transformation to ensure that 1.5 is actually in real terms kept under control, even though they talk a lot about it. So let me stop here, and if you have questions. Thank you. That was a little over 45 minutes. So
thank you, Dr. Jayaraman, for the comprehensive and exhaustive presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We start probably with here. If there's anything inside. Yes. Yeah, just a second. I'll give you a mic, sir. Just a second.
The question is a little bit technical. It is about GST. How you are estimating the GST, the global stock tech?
Huh?
Global stocks tech, GST. You talk about GST. How does it get estimated?
No. See, the stock take, that's why the term is conveyed. There's no particular stock we are estimating. Taking stock is an English expression, meaning an assessment. So the typical American fashion, they converted it into stock take, and unhappily it made it through all the way into the Paris Agreement. I have never been a fan of it in terms of the English language. We could have chosen a better term. We could have called it the 5-year review, and it would have been just as good. But anyway, so that's
I think there's a question online. Given your remarks about biofuels, do you think the Global Biofuels Alliance is a good idea? What specific aspects should it focus on from an Indian perspective?
Yes. There's a request. Can you keep the slides and the chat open together? difficult. Huh? Just try, because there's a request. Thank you, Vulka, for this question. I think the Global Biofuels Alliance is not necessarily a bad thing. I think if we can use crop residue, etc., some percentage of biofuels is good. But I think we need a deeper study. We need a deeper study for the impact on food production. And all that we know in the scenarios suggests that large-scale CDR, carbon dioxide removal, which is actually essential for making the 1.5 degree scenarios even happen. Without assuming in some scenarios as much as the entire carbon budget, another 500 gigatons, it is assumed, will be absorbed by the biosphere through human efforts. So without those assumptions, 1.5 degree is not within reach at all. And this has repeatedly, I think, scenarios are showing, especially the work of Fujimori and Hasegawa, that this has very serious consequences for food security, risk of hunger, and poverty alleviation itself. Now, I think at the time these political decisions are taken, perhaps the scientific evidence is not always present before them. So we need to engage with those involved in the biofuel sector with how exactly we are going to ensure food security is not disturbed by this. You will recall that 2008 itself, the food price spike globally was attributed to biofuel demand. So I think this is something. The problem is not necessarily only sugarcane. There has been a back and forth on it, which I mentioned. But when corn, etc., start getting into the picture, then the issues have to be looked at carefully. So in India, we need to, at the very least, regulate this very carefully. And this is something I think all of us should be engaged in. Certainly, I'm sure we would be engaged in some way in MSSRF.
There's another question online. Do you think developing countries should start saying that 1.5 degrees is not possible, not with the current level of ambition displayed by the developed countries? Some scientists have begun saying that 1.5 is completely out of reach.
Well, it's a sad story, but unfortunately, the issue is that if developing countries, some of them, like India and China, will, if we say officially that 1.5 is not accessible any longer, then of course the global media will go after that. So I do not expect New Delhi or Riyadh to issue a statement saying that 1.5 is out of reach. But we, as the scientific community, my colleague Navroz Dubar, with whom perhaps I do not agree on other policy issues, has made this point very clearly. 1.5 appears out of reach, which is why people are talking of so-called overshoot scenarios, which basically means that you will cross 1.5 degrees, but by, again, an assumption with huge amounts of methane reduction through essentially focusing on mitigation in agriculture and natural resource sector, you will somehow bring it quickly back under control. These are all assumptions, so I think this is something of an issue. So we can't say it, but certainly the country and those who are involved in various sectors, especially adaptation, may I underline this, should not be looking at 1.5. There is a lot of literature from developed countries saying somehow 1.5 is like some tipping point. Frankly, if that was so, then we can give up. And I don't see how we can, for instance, there was a lot of talk about limits to adaptation. We were very concerned that we will not accept the term limits to adaptation in the GGA. India said it in several ways on many occasions. What do you mean limits to adaptation? Over, you can't adapt. You can talk about it in ecosystems or species or something. Limits to adaptation. Human society, what do you mean limits to adaptation? Well, luckily, the term has not found any mention in the documents of decisions of COP28, which is an excellent thing. So these are, on these issues, 1.5 is not, we should not be scared about going beyond 1.5. Some of it will be a necessity. We must do our best, whatever we can contribute to keeping it as low as possible, well below 2 degrees. But nevertheless, it is not the case to simply fall back in alarm at the mention of crossing 1.5. This is my suggestion. If Dr. Hariharan had a question, and then I'll take the ECDD question.
Yeah. Okay.
Sir, thank you. Actually, in this COP, if you specifically look at, we heard you thoroughly and how the global negotiation went and all those things. All these things will continue to happen, and we need to fight for our rights for a long time now. But in this COP, two major issues, especially COP specifically focused on the agriculture, and they came out with the document, right? Policy document. Similarly on the health also. If you can outline certain key elements of it, that will be wonderful. And what are all the takeaways for Foundation? Yeah.
See, there are, first when we talk about, let me start answering it in reverse. So when you say takeaways from the foundation, for takeaways for the foundation and from the foundation, why not, from our experience. So when you talk about that, I think we must make a clear distinction about what we experiment with in our country, what we try out, what we want to do, what are new approaches. We cannot be static when we are not dumb to the world. We are listening, we are reacting. However, it is very different from allowing that to dictate our priorities and being aware of our priorities, and even more, not making an international commitment on this issue. So it is one thing to say mitigation is, for instance, will dry seeding of rice contribute to mitigation? Of course it will. Will SRI contribute? Of course it will. Will neem-coated urea? Yes, there are estimates of how much it is contributing. But that does not mean that we will go to, these are, and mind you, these are not absolute reduction in emissions. With the per unit production, the emissions goes down. The footprint is decreased. But we are not, I think government, India was very clear at COP28 that these are not meant to be statements to be turned into international commitments. So that is in practical terms. Why is it that we had issues? Because in various iterations of the leaders' declaration on agriculture, it was found that it was repeatedly had elements of making agriculture a mitigation centric. Now, the statement that agriculture contributes 30% of emissions is completely incorrect, because that is only if you include scope 2, scope 3 emissions outside. And India is outside the farm gate. So India's position was very clear that one, there is the defense of the most vulnerable, which is at stake. And India's vulnerable are within the scope of our less than 4% of global cumulative emission from 1850 to today. So why should we ask our farmer to bear the burden of mitigation? If he rationalizes input use, that is a separate issue. So this is so anything which involves the supply chains is for other actors to talk about, we are not going to package supply chains and the small producer in a single word called systems. So we were open to the use of the term food production systems, but food systems was something which we reacted to. On health again, decarbonizing the health sector is not a commitment or an agreement we will make at the international level. We will not talk about the supply chain. I saw a piece in the Hindu today saying it is because of India's cooling requirements and cooling gases. They work on that topic, but cooling is not the only issue. There are many aspects. So, for instance, if you take big pharma on the one side, and and on the other side you have the PHC, and you package all of it together in the term health system. That's not something we will accept. So India was very clear on this in terms of health. So if the fact that health is a priority and climate and health is this thing is something India has recognized domestically. There is a new climate and health mission, which of course must be ramped up. There are many aspects to be looked at. Not only vector change in the vector distribution, but a colleague recently asked me for some inputs into something he's working on, the development of antimicrobial resistance, AMR, in the context of changing climate. So these are all things we should continue to do. So that's not an issue.
Sir, most of us will also agree with you that we should not be succumbing to pressures and start telling something. But we are an organization where we focus more on do ecology issues, especially when we work with the small and marginal farmers, fishers, and tribal people. What kind of evidences we need to bring in so that we can demonstrate both at national and at the global level, which will be more meaningful. You know the spectrum of work what we do here, right from fishery sectors to. So what kind of programs will be more interesting to demonstrate in the field? Last few weeks, this region is receiving the maximum rainfall. Some people connect it with climate change. Some people say the climate change is nothing to do with this kind of very heavy rainfall in certain selected locations and so on. Under this scenario, what kind of do ecologies will be more meaningful?
Sir, Dr. Hariharan, I am not going to answer this right now. This is something
this is a question that our people need to also ponder.
I completely agree with you. What is it from our experience? There's a dear colleague who had a question for a bit. Dr. Bhatt had a question on COP16 of CBDs with Colombia in 2024. This is a very problematic issue. The COP16 of CBD, which will follow the COP15 where we pass the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, will be all about implementation. And Colombia, unfortunately, has turned out in this UNFCCC to be a country which is very closely aligned with developed countries. Okay? Their attitude, they had a very eloquent minister at the COP, and we listened, of course, with great respect, as one always does. But the point that Colombia repeatedly made was that we will first give up our coal. We are the world's 5th largest coal exporter. We will give up our coal. Now help us to manage. Now, I think if Colombia wants to take such a decision as a sovereign nation, it is their right. But as a nation of 1.2 billion plus, if we first give up our existing ways of doing things, our existing livelihood arrangements, our existing employment pattern, our existing natural resource endowment, and then say, please help us, who's going to help a country of 1.2 billion people? It doesn't work like this. So with this message to get across was one of the sticking points. The other thing coming from the CBD, there was a lot of attempts to put the conservation targets of the CBD as adaptation goals in the GST and in the global goal and adaptation. This did not happen, but this is a debate that it will continue. My own personal view is, having looked at the cited evidence for protected areas and conserved areas, assisting in adaptation. Conservation, yes. Assisting in adaptation, I believe that the evidence is too thin. And therefore, India is a signatory in the CBD. India has made whatever positions it needs to do. It has clarified in the CBD. But linking the CBD to the UNFCCC requires a much stronger scientific evidence and foundation than one has seen in the assessed literature at this time. So I would say that, the last point in response to Dr. Bhatt is that differentiation, the equity CBDR-RC kind of positioning that we, policy framework that we have in the UNFCCC is much weaker in the CBD. And so, if we import the weakness of CBD on equity issues into the UNFCCC, that would not serve the purpose. So I think if you are assured that the stronger intent of the UNFCCC helps the CBD find its path, that would be welcome. But currently, that does not seem to be happening. So I think this is an important issue to be faced in the coming years, a double challenge, perhaps maybe even greater than COP29. So that's my take on that.
Oh, one. Want to look at the questions and then pick, or how do you want to do this? There's one on the EU and US in terms of the phase-out language. And US not taking on phase-out language for fossil fuels.
That's our friend, colleague Shrija, asking, why do you think the EU and US were pushing for including the fossil fuel phase out in COP28 when they have no plans of reducing consumption or production in the near future? Good question. I think, one of the things is they have an environmental agenda. And the environmental agenda of the big countries as well, the superpowers, is not like a conspiracy theory, that every part of it works perfectly in sync. So their environmental agenda gets out of sync with the oil and gas agenda, which is why you had all these fantastic statements they all made at COP28. The next day you see that the French oil company, Shell, and somebody else went to Suriname and signed a huge oil and gas deal with Suriname. The next day, they did the same thing after COP26. And once the Ukraine conflict began, they decided to open up coal also. So I think a lot of the story of the urgency of 1.5, this, etc., is driven by their perception or based on the scenarios and that kind of ideas. It is to restrict the growth in the developing world and seen as a potential competitor for resources. As Shrija will know, this goes back to the Club of Rome, and we have always had to do this. And Al Gore even, nice guy, Al Gore, hero of climate change. But even he used to say, like George Bush, China and India are developing, they will eat more, so there's pressure on global resources. This has been said. In fact, you will find it in Inconvenient Truth. So that's the thing. Honest assessment of how we lost on GGA, I don't think on GGA we have lost. I think honestly, we must accept Unlike mitigation, GGA, the global goal on adaptation is complex. If once you start thinking about what do you mean by a global goal on adaptation, there are honest differences within developing countries, within our friends from developing countries who are otherwise we are perfectly together. So I think GGA will require patience, will require effort, will require more science and a willingness to look beyond the obvious sort of slogan statements that are being made. So this is work for the future, and I think we need to contribute to that. This is very important.
I think maybe one last question, then there is one here. So you want to answer that? Can polluter pay concept be applicable?
I think we have crossed this, but this was maybe in the early days of the UNFCCC. See, the point is, it's very difficult to call carbon a pollutant. Mercury maybe, lead maybe. Carbon is, our bodies are made of carbon. Carbon is a stuff of life. You go around saying carbon is a pollutant, carbon is a pollutant. There's something fundamentally, scientifically incoherent about it, no? So the whole point is the global carbon budget as a global commons. That we call a sea a threat. We don't call the sea a threat, but can the sea be a threat? Yes, it can be a threat. But is the sea necessary for us? Yes, the oceans are necessary, but you pollute the oceans, you will have trouble. But that comes external to the sea, no? No, there are people who talk about ocean-based mitigation, respected scientists, I won't name him, who gave an interview to some Guardian or I don't know where, saying that ocean-based mitigation is necessary especially for the island states. That's completely ridiculous. Industrial emissions are leading to sea level rise. Ocean-based mitigation, what will it do for island states? Very straight. These things happen.
In the interest of time, we'll take one last question and close.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think you also have one. Okay, then two last questions from here and close.
Yeah.
Anbhani and then.
Actually, sir, with respect to India's position in climate policies, we have a national policy and a state policy already existing, and a more of mitigation plan is going on across states as well as in national level. How is COP28's India's position will transform into a policy document, and how it will change the way that governments work?
The very fact that you asked this question, I am delighted because a lot of people who should know better are not aware of this. So, in fact, I think one of our problems is that we need to come out of the project experimental mode of the way we are doing climate policy. That doesn't mean we need a climate law or a climate ministry. That's not what I am saying. But I think a much tighter understanding of the role of various arms of government and industry within the framework of the larger policy. What is it we do or we don't do is very important. So I am deeply concerned, for instance, all the initiatives on carbon trading which are happening. And here we are saying we need a fair share of the carbon budget. And people argue that $5 a ton per all, $5 a ton for carbon is okay, which is, that's not something we should be doing. So I think we need a much better understanding of how our overall position affects in detail our actual climate policies, and carbon trading in particular is a very problematic area. And this mitigation centric, which we have discussed on other occasions before, that is a consequence. So I think we need to look at that a little carefully. Yes, one last question.
Sir, we are long back, we are keep on talking about the 1.5 degree this thing. But unfortunately, some of the reports already saying that we are almost reached 1.4 now, which is the average temperature reached 1.4. Okay. So now we are setting the target like points, 1.7 to 2, which is like 0.3 to 0.6. Okay. So do you think it is really achievable, or still the goalpost will change?
I think this there is a lot of academics, have this problem. Every year they want to write a new paper. So sometimes they are tired of saying the same thing, so they want to say something new. So there is this new industry about arguing month by month how we have crossed the long-term average. So this was the hottest September ever, especially this year, they are putting out all these numbers. Nobody mentions the fact that this year is the least ever in terms of heat wave mortality. Okay, so you have to have a balance. So when you say 1.5 degree warming, one is typically speaking of a 20-year average. Now people are trying to fiddle that average, saying no, urgency is there, so we must calculate the average. So a new suggestion for the average is you take the last 10 years, which is observed data, you take the coming 10 years in terms of projections and take an average, even average. So, so all these games have begun. So I think the real indicator of what we have under control or not is still, I believe, for all its uncertainty, the global carbon budget. So if you look at the NDCs that we have now, till 2030, how much cumulative emissions we will create, and how much is left for 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, you can work out. So if we go that way, I think this whole idea of keeping our target within reach becomes much clearer. So I think to answer your question, yes, there are ways of handling this problem, but we have to persuade, at least in our policy making, to have this perspective very clear. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jayaraman, for this wonderful
Thank you.
talk. And I think if those who have more questions, you can share Dr. Jayaraman's email ID, so you can get in touch with them if you need further clarifications. So,
I'll make
Yes.
the presentation available.
sure. We have a recording also, so those who need, who haven't been able to make it here, we can share a link to the recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for those who joined online as well as those here. The meeting is closed for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Yeah.